Pinto, Head of Solutions Engineering at Lightyear, to take us through designing the optimal WAN for your enterprise.
Good afternoon, everybody. So there's a lot of material that I'm about to run through here at a pretty accelerated pace. We're going to try to push this through as rapidly as possible to get to the discussion at the end. One of the final slides will be a link to a resource on the Lightyear webpage that I've gone through all of this material in pretty great detail with lots of notes and verbiage, so that if you want to go back and read more, or you can feel free to reach out to us after the event if you want more information on anything that's about to be covered. So when you're designing an optimal WAN, one of the recurrent themes is going to be redundancy and diversity throughout the entire process. And then after it's done, keeping up with the redundancy and diversity. There's been kind of a expanding and contrasting nature or collapsing nature within the carriers in the telecom space. So when you initially go in and you put in your optimal WAN and you do your provider selections, making sure that as they go through their mergers and acquisitions, that you're not losing any of the diversity and redundancy, something that you're going to have to keep up with throughout the life cycle of your WAN. We're going to talk about some of the different connection types briefly. And we're going to talk about how to set up the core and the backbone. And once your major core backbone network connectivity is set up, then we'll talk a little bit about best practices for applications, connectivity to branch offices, remote users, and then security. And I added a slide actually last minute. For whatever reason, over the course of the past week, we at Lightyear have seen a pretty significant uptick in people reaching out to us for assistance with security incidents. So wanted to kind of key in on that a little bit too before we jump off of this. So the network core. So a lot of times we identify a location on the customer network as the main location or corporate. In some instances, that's really easy to identify, but some of the larger enterprise customers that I've had the opportunity to work with, they've had a lot of mergers and acquisitions. And then through those mergers and acquisitions, you end up with kind of mini headquarters offices. And that's fine. If there's no, predefined, it has to be 3, it has to be 1. It's whatever works right for your enterprise. But as you go through that, you'll also find that some of the locations that are still earmarked as maybe a mini HQ because you picked it up as part of a merger and acquisition might not need to maintain the same level of redundancy as what you would have in a data center. So what you see here, once you identify which locations, and in this example, I'm calling the main location the corporate site, and then a couple of data centers. When you're selecting your sites, especially if you're a global enterprise, you're going to want to make sure that there are instances of applications and remote users and branch offices can connect back to a more geographic location than having to really come across the entire globe. All kinds of latency and jitter and delay issues when you have that large of a track to get back to resources. So you're going to want to set up, whatever your applications are and whatever your business critical applications are, you're going to want to set them up so that they're synchronizing across a private network. I prefer wave technology right now. It's got a very low latency and a very high visibility for the end users. We go into pretty great detail to try to provide carrier diversity as well as route diversity. So drilling down with the carriers, making sure that we get KMZ data so that the paths of the providers are not in the same easements and the same right of ways, or that they're subletting from each other. So we make sure that we drill down all the way through to make sure that you've got clear carrier and path diversity. And you'll see that I've got an MPLS cloud in the middle. Now, I don't typically run MPLS for site-to-site connectivity recommendations anymore. There are some where it makes sense, but from my IT background, I've had more than one instance where at a data center, a change was made or something was done and lost all connectivity. So for out-of-band connectivity, that's primarily what I'm using MPLS and recommending MPLS for. I connected into console servers, and then from those console servers, those are networked out to all of the key hardware that's in the data centers in the main locations. So the last piece to getting the core ready for branch connectivity is how do you want the branches to connect back? So in the past, there have been and still is a use case for MPLS and VPNs. But what we're seeing more and more of is SD-WAN and also taking SSE or SASE deployments for SD-WAN. And really what you're looking for is, like if you look at the site 2 on the bottom left, we've got multiple carriers, and then you've got multiple topology connecting types, so that site 2, there's a whole lot of stuff that would have to go bad from a provider and a carrier standpoint before all communications to site 2 were to go down. If you look at kind of the top of the diagram where it connects just simply to the public internet, what we're recommending and what we're seeing more of is providers in the SASE and the SD-WAN environment that have their own middle mile network. And the reason that that's very advantageous is it gives the opportunity to offload a lot of the more popular SaaS providers traffic before it has to hairpin through a corporate site. So, the traditional way would be a branch location connects back to corporate. They live behind the firewall at corporate, and if they want to go back out, then they go right back out through the same firewall. By putting that middle mile in the in the path of the connection, if someone needs to get to a popular SaaS like a Salesforce or a Zoom or DocuSign are the examples in there, it doesn't have to hairpin through corporate anymore. But on that same token, if there are any hosted applications that are going on at corporate or at any of the data centers, that connectivity is preserved. So at this point, you've got a core network, and then you've got connectivity ready for bringing on branch locations. Security, as you see on here, I'm showing firewalls at each one of the locations, but also the SASE providers. It's got like zero trust networking, and there's clients, and there's additional security layered on top of that. We'll get into that a little bit more in just a second. So this example here, I'm showing branch offices in the UK and China and Australia, right? So those other branch sites, we're doing the same level of effort on trying to find carrier diversity. And depending on how critical the site is, sometimes we even drill down and do path diversity. But carrier diversity is normally the table stakes in making sure that a good SD-WAN or SASE deployment goes off. One of the other more popular things is taking your remote users, instead of having them terminate to like a VPN concentrator at corporate or a data center, with the SASE middle mile, it gives those folks like a zero trust ability to connect into the network. It's a very simplified explanation right now, but basically what that gives those remote users is, if that person is in Hawaii and the main corporate location is New York City, they don't have to establish a VPN from Hawaii to New York. Whoever that middle mile network is being provided by, they will have POPs geographically distributed. So your remote users will connect to the closest POP, and then from there, the traffic will route wherever it needs to route to on the network. Again, one of the key considerations, even for branch sites, is going to be that redundancy and diversity from the carriers. I hinted that we were going to talk a little about security. One of the main, I think, overlooked security components is going to be the security awareness training. The human element, the making sure your users know how their internet behavior and their interactions with the network, how it can affect the greater good. And obviously the table stakes, making sure there's endpoint protection and some sort of a response, an incident response going on. Having that middle mile network and the zero trust and the Cloudflare logo there in the middle, they're one of the leaders in that, but there's a lot of companies that are doing that now. Putting in place a mail filter to make sure that inbound email is scanned before sending any potential harmful attachments into your corporate environment. Obviously, firewalling is still a huge component to proper perimeter security, multi-factor authentication, identification of users, and then as you cascade down into your corporate environment, making sure that your encryption is your data is encrypted both while it's at rest and in transit is pretty significant, especially when there's like middle mile or middle man in the middle types of attacks that are still taking place. Backups with air gaps, and obviously making sure that you're running some type of endpoint protection and incident response on all of your corporate assets. For whatever reason, security is, like I said, we've seen a pretty significant uptake over the course of the last week or so. I went through quite a few design elements at very rapid pace, and what I wanted to make sure is, again, on our webpage, there's a resources tab. And if you go into the resources tab and you search for designing the optimal wide area network, there's a whole post in here where, again, I go very detailed and use a lot of explanations for each one of those network topologies, pros, cons, and kind of deep dive into each of these thought processes. So if you do have any questions on things that I went over pretty rapidly, please post them, and Victoria will make sure that they get asked at the end of the presentation. But I wanted to make sure that we press forward and spend a little bit of time with someone who's going to be able to speak to a customer journey. So Prashanth is on the call with us today. Prashanth, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and Flume?
Yeah, definitely. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for having me on, Matt, Rob, Victoria. I'm Prashanth, the co-founder CEO of Flume Internet. We are a last mile broadband fiber to the home, and now, recently fiber to the commercial building provider. The business specifically is about 3 years old, and we serve, all sorts of customers, from municipalities to big multifamily portfolios to now also commercial building portfolios. A little bit of background on myself. I am a sort of fiber outside plant engineer background by trade, and a network engineer. Started my career at Verizon, and then was a part of a kind of early stage startup effort at a company called Pilot Fiber here in New York City that built, enterprise WAN and local networks in 5 or 6 cities around the US. And then about 3 years ago, I left with a few sort of real estate and engineering folks, and we launched Flume with the idea that there is a lot of unused co-location space and fiber infrastructure in many sort of residential areas that we can tap into and serve home broadband or broadband for other uses that are currently being underserved. And so we have been involved with Lightyear, I think, since sort of the early days of Lightyear's product expansion, and definitely use it as a tool, especially in new markets, to find connectivity options for us, primarily on the dark fiber side, core network side, as well as out of band circuits, et cetera. So that's kind of a quick background on myself as well as Flume.
Hey, Prashanth, thank you again for your time today. Just thinking back about like diversity in network planning, I see from our attendees today that we have both like ISPs and MSPs that are on the call, as well as traditional enterprises. When you think about diversity in network planning, is it all the same, or should like the enterprise be taking a different approach from an ISP?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of general similarities in building for network redundancy, around path diversity, POP or edge network diversity, and power. But for an ISP versus enterprise, I think there are a few maybe subtle differences. The biggest one being, an ISP is generally planning for a lot more sort of customer premise endpoints in an individual geography. And so, we generally tend to see ISPs opt for point of presence or POP diversity, as well as building ring architectures a lot sooner. Whereas an enterprise, customer in an individual building might actually just be more concerned about carrier or path diversity to that specific building. And I think it's sort of a question of, in a specific geography, at what point do you believe you need to start planning for maybe sort of a city scale or a local scale versus just a couple of HQs or retail sites. So I think that's
As part of that planning, like how was your experience, and what was it like doing the fiber network with Pilot Fiber?
Yeah, so with pilot, initially we in the footprint that we had started leasing dark fiber and had a more sort of star topology, if you will, on the legacy network. And then as the volume increased, specifically in New York and other cities, we were able to get fiber franchises ourselves. And it's because, for both capacity and diversity, most of the co-located data centers, for example, in Manhattan or in lower Manhattan, and you really need to be able to build a ring, kind of around the entire island to build redundancy. So we were able to do that, over sort of 2 or 3 years on our own fiber network.
So when as you're talking about like star topologies and core, I mean, what are your considerations when you're building out your core?
Yeah, so I think when building out the core network to serve, let's call it 100 to 150 maybe endpoint buildings in a specific market, we generally look for, the primary goal is definitely optimizing for price for rack space and power. But beyond that, it's, a path to basically 3 POP sites in a specific geography that we can connect in a ring, where we use, primarily wave for the core traffic and the high bandwidth. And then we will use an MPLS or sometimes in more remote areas, even LTE out of band provisioning and management for each site. The core network itself then consists of, basically IP transit, high capacity circuits back to the greater internet. And then we constantly monitor the traffic and will determine when to directly peer out of certain markets to specific content based on what the customer traffic looks like.
Yeah, clearly, like a lot of thought and planning goes into your your diversity and network building plans. The question that I have, and I think can sometimes be difficult to answer, is like, how do you know like where to draw the line and how much diversity you want to build in? Because there's always like there's a cost constraint, and sometimes like with Matt talking about like carrier diversity, that can come at a in many cases like a very reasonable cost. When you start wanting to take it past that and get path diversity and all different types of diversity built in, like the cost to do that can exponentially increase. So how do those two worlds sort of fit together when you're in the planning stages?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the 2 biggest inputs we look at are the volume of traffic and the quality of traffic that we are trying to serve when we try and sort of determine, redundancy. We've found that in the past, doing it by number of sites or customers, it's not really the most exact one-to-one. But on the volume of traffic front, when we launch in any market, I think that's just certain sort of traffic subscription thresholds. We have implemented ROI rules where we will just go add the next site and implement failover at a market level. On the quality of traffic side, generally with the primary product for Flume and home broadband, it is, best effort, if you will, but as a sort of early growing brand, we don't want our customers to experience downtime at all, really. So when we're kind of early on entering a market, we will generally tend to overinvest in diversity, redundancy. I think one general point I'll say is, when building over fiber, whether you're an enterprise or an ISP, the networks are generally more passive, and the places we find the most potential for failure is active elements and power, especially depending on the market and the customer premise building. So almost more than the network redundancy and diversity, we'll tend to overinvest first on power and backup.
So you kind of touched on the differences and the different types of folks that we have in attendance, but from your perspective, are there different design elements that you consider like as an ISP, and from an ISP's perspective is like, maybe that would differ from a traditional user or an MSP?
Yeah, I think the biggest one might be in any market really understanding our footprint and scale. We tend to purchase circuits, rack space footprints that are more modular and scalable. We'll generally pay for shorter term lengths or the ability to upgrade into burstable circuits. I think in a way that probably as an enterprise kind of IT purchaser, you know your footprint. It's a little bit more of a known quantity in a specific geography. So I think the number one, and this is something we learned, like every sort of early stage network where our first few data centers we sort of overbuilt and then we understood the capacity and recalibrated. And I think it's the ability to, yeah, can we're a Juniper platform, and can we put in the sort of SRX switches in a way that we can get a remote hands person to just go in and bond or add the next 40 gig link out of the data center, et cetera. So I think scalability in a modular way is the sort of most cost effective and number one thing that we've begun optimizing for. And then the second one is, I think, the physical paths of the network and the rings that we want to build in different markets. This is something I think that's, as an enterprise buyer, is something I think about. It's extremely difficult, I think, to tell, but in any given market, when you're getting a KMZ from a specific carrier, there are sort of known areas of infrastructure issues that you may want to avoid. Certain co-location sites that have had a history of, I don't know, sort of zero manhole gas leaks, or all sorts of sort of local natural issues. And I think that's the second biggest thing we try and do our homework on in a market.
You talked a little bit about lessons learned, and maybe was there any like main differences between your experience of doing the build outs with Pilot Fiber as opposed to with Flume?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference, especially from going from an enterprise ISP to residential, is planning for bigger scale. At Flume, we need to put out maybe 100 to 200 different ONTs for every single install a commercial provider does. So it's starting off with a lot more pop diversity and basically fiber capacity from day one. On the implementation side, it's a lot more integration of remote hands and sort of non-in-house technicians. And I think the big sort of underlying thing that we have to build there is sort of easy ways to one-touch provision devices and sort of operationally scale with little sort of required Flume network hands or need for every individual customer that comes on the network. And I think Pilot and Enterprise ISP, you have the ability to do a little bit more white glove service just due to the fact that the installation volumes are smaller.
Right on.
We've talked a lot about like connectivity and access. In the design stage, like when do you start thinking about like equipment redundancy and like N+1 or 2N+1?
Yeah, I think again, it kind of goes back to traffic volumes is the rules that we base everything off of. And generally we view equipment redundancy in two forms. The first form of equipment redundancy is sort of having it either on site or in the market, but depowered. There's a sort of, let's call it like the 4-hour local SLA. And there's a certain sort of subset of equipment that we keep in that bucket. And then at larger scale or sites that have, at least for us, about 10 gigs of core network traffic, we will have live powered equipment and live failover capability. In general, we don't see, especially on the residential network side, there isn't a big need to do a lot of automatic. The difference between sort of automatic failover versus running through our alerting and triage process, the sort of 5 minutes it takes us to do the manual failover, is generally acceptable in certain cases, but we do plan for, automatically failing over to most of our network equipment that is energized and live.
I see.
But it is a traffic calculation.
Okay, and you've mentioned power a couple times at this point. Like, how does that fit into this? And you're going into data centers for the most part, which are supposed to be, highly resilient in this aspect. But how do you look at that, and what's your process in making those evaluations?
Yeah, I think at the co-location sites, I should say, at data centers, we generally don't run into power issues. It's more of a power capacity. You want to make sure you're buying the right type of power and the amount you need to expand and add. You may have one switch with one card today, and each card you add into switches these days adds X amount of power, et cetera. So yeah, generally it's just a purchasing decision at the data center. At the edge sites, I think, for example, in New York, we service about 6,000 New York City affordable housing apartments, where we put our edge, like the routing, switching, and the OLTs on site. And there we do invest in either rack-based PDU backup or your more traditional sort of car batteries in a pack, and then managing it with the rack-based PDU.
And you talked a little bit, KMZ data and POPs, and just like what are your thoughts around design considerations for geographic diversity?
Yeah, I think you mentioned this, I think, earlier in the presentation, but the carrier diversity ultimately is kind of the most important thing. And if you're not a carrier on the ISP side, we have some ability to determine where we build out fiber at the middle mile level. For an ISP, we basically have distance requirements. Like if somebody asks us for a diverse circuit, there's about like a 40 to 50 meter distance for urban and kind of all these rules. And then there's sort of one sort of ratcheting up, which is entrance diversity into the building or into the premise. And that's something a lot of carriers will charge more for, because often, especially these big commercial multi-tenant buildings in cities, there is a lot of work being done at the entry sort of MPOE level. And so, entrance diversity is something we think about for a lot of our bigger edge sites that are, feeding 1,000 or 1,500 customers. I would say, yeah, on the ISP side, entrance diversity, and then sort of ring diversity at a specific sort of minimum physical distance is key. And then on the enterprise consumer side, yeah, like you mentioned, I think carrier diversity is really important, and make sure you get the right KMZs and the test results from the carriers. Look at them, make sure it's generally pretty tough these days to get a 100% sort of non-overlapping network, especially if you're going back to the same colo site, but kind of striving for as little overlap as possible is.
One of the other things I talked about a little bit, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts about it, is there's a lot of cloud adoption going on, and from an ISP's perspective, I mean, what effects does that have? And what are your thoughts on the pretty prolific cloud adoption that's taking place right now?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing we see is a lot of folks deciding to not purchase DIA to the customer prem and purchase some sort of layer 2 circuit and decide to run their own network locally, or a lot of sort of managed building. I think in our world, the cloud adoption, at least at the property level, seems to be around a lot of managed services that people can now spin up themselves, put in a half rack at the data center, and then kind of buy layer 2 traffic from a carrier, versus buying the connectivity themselves. So that's one trend we see. I think on the co-location side, there's always, the sort of choiciest co-locations all remain pretty difficult to get rack space and in big geographies. And I think that's a trend that's still going to continue. If you look at like I don't know, the Digital Realty 111/8 in New York City, it's like you got to wait about 6 to 8 months to get a half rack. So that stuff will continue. There is a lot of capacity at other data centers in these cities, but they're just not interconnected in. And so I think we'll also see a lot more, campus data center interconnections in cities to sort of account for this capacity and getting people to the right meet me room and cross connect without having to actually physically create more space at that data center.
Right on. Well, thank you. I'm getting pinged by Victoria and told that as much as we could probably sit here and keep going, there are a few questions that have come in. I don't know how we want to kind of handle these real quick, but I'll toss them out. The first one is one that I'm comfortable speaking to, but Rob, I don't know if you want to take the first stab at it. Question is, what is the difference between a dedicated fiber line and a dark fiber line? You want to take a stab at that, or you want me to swing?
Go ahead.
All right, so dark fiber line is literally, what that says, right? It's you're getting a piece of glass for, just the route from two different and clearly defined endpoints. Where that becomes pretty advantageous is if those two endpoints are, relatively close to one another, and you've got the support infrastructure to keep up with the optics on either side of that, then the dark fiber becomes, a pretty easy decision to make. As that distance increases, like you could, theoretically lease dark fiber from New York to LA. The thing that a lot of people don't realize when they're putting in that sort of a request, though, is that any repeater stations that are necessary to accommodate that signal between those two locations, that's entirely on the end user customer's responsibility. So having both the optics to do the repeaters along the path, as well as the staff to manage and maintain them, that's a pretty significant requirement. So a dedicated fiber line can be one of a pretty significant number of things, right? So I've got your name, and I can follow up with you and make sure that I'm answering this adequately. But a dedicated fiber line could be like a wave, like a DWDM type of a service. It is dedicated to a single user, but you could also get dedicated internet. So the dedicated fiber line, maybe we can have a more of an interaction and not so much of a webinar discussion about that. But hopefully I answered at least part of your question and differentiated. So, because again, a dark fiber line, I would kind of put that as a service that would fall underneath a dedicated fiber type of a service, but there's several others that would also fall under that category. So I'm going to move on to the next one. And if I did not answer you appropriately, please reach out and I'll be more than happy to follow up with you. So the next one, and guys, I'm going to just kind of toss this one up if either one of you guys want to swing at it. Building a new age MSP business, would like to learn if we could integrate your system using APIs as part of our offering to customers. It's probably more of a Rob one than anybody.
Yes. And we do have API availability coming before the end of the year. So we should plan to align as we get closer to that time.
Right on. Next, and again, the thing, if these are not, if the answers, if you'd like to follow up more, post follow-up questions, or just reach out to us directly, we'll set aside some time. What criteria do you use to select the appropriate carriers? I mean, we from Lightyear, right? If you're asking it as a question to Lightyear, I think we would have maybe a different response than what Prashanth would give, but I'll give you the Lightyear response. And really, what we're doing is we're trying to enable the platform users to make that decision. We're providing you with data. We're typically not the ones that are selecting the carriers. When you log on to the Lightyear platform and you fill out the questionnaire, and then what we're looking for are providers that meet the criteria that you input as part of your questionnaire. The selection process is the end user customers. So Prashanth, I don't know if you want to answer that one from a Flume perspective as well, but that would be the Lightyear response. What about Flume?
Yeah, I think the Lightyear, in the Lightyear platform, when you get this sort of, I guess laundry nutrition label of data for each carrier, the things we're interested in, I mean, the circuit type, capacity, price, those are all kind of the givens. But then I think the maybe more nuanced things to look for, it's definitely the path, if they're willing to share the path to the building. Usually that happens after you've selected them or kind of gone a little further down the process. And then I would say where they terminate is something that we're very interested in. There's many colos and campus situations around cities where your carrier is not in the meet me room that you're in, and you're now paying, an extra few thousand a month or few hundred a month to run patch cables. So that's definitely an important one. And then I think finally, if you're sort of a seasoned IT buyer, I'm sure that there's a lot of sort of a service delivery and review type of databases you can tap into or read about. A lot of carriers, we're very interested in, hey, if there is a fiber cut, like what is your process? How many subcontractors are you going to go to before somebody sends us an OTDR shot or some, analysis? So I think doing some research around how the service delivery of a lot of these commercial carriers in specific areas works also helps, but that's a little bit more inexact.
Right on. Next question. I noticed that many dark fiber providers show identical routes as their competitors. When selecting fiber, how do you determine you're actually getting diversity and redundancy in your routes? So I'll take a stab at this one, and then I would also be interested to hear, Prashanth, how you would answer that. But so from a Lightyear perspective, right? The way that process normally runs is the users will log on to the Lightyear platform, again, fill out the questionnaire about what it is that they're looking for and what locations they're trying to connect via dark fiber. We will find the appropriate providers that can satisfy the requirements, if there are any. There are often times that someone's looking for a dark fiber, connection to a place that's just too far away from fiber assets that it's just not feasible. But given, the criteria are met and there are more than one provider that can do it, again, the Lightyear platform is all about enabling the end user to make that decision and providing you with quantifiable data. So what the platform will find is it will get the providers that are available, it will get their price quote, and then we will also request KMZ data through the platform and then reveal that to you and show you that, here's how the different providers' fibers physically installed in the ground. We have a very high success rate. There are some providers that just simply do not provide KMZ files. And then at that point, you have to make the determination on whether you want to assume that risk and say, okay, well, this, and a lot of times by accepting that risk, what we find is it's a price-based, like, well, it's so inexpensive that, I'm willing to roll the dice, but it's really all about, we will give you as much data as that provider is willing to provide, and then you can make the decision on which way forward it works the best for your business. So Prashanth, what from your perspective?
Yeah, no, I think the dark fiber, especially, and a lot of these fiber networks, that's sort of the challenge in cities, is there may only be a couple of big mainline backbone paths around the city, et cetera. There can be significant overlap. Really understanding the options, making sure you get the path and understand what the percentage overlap is very important. I think other strategies for mitigation, the biggest one is consider doing different types of circuits, not just dark fiber. There's a good chance that some other provider or an MPLS provider, something that's like Sonnet or switched Ethernet over fiber, there's other types of circuits that probably don't take these, shared dark fiber only backbones around the city or around any geography. So that's one thing we've seen in the most extreme case, for management or low data uses, LTE out of band. Yeah, and then the final one, I guess, kind of on that line is we don't do a lot of it ourselves, but we do see some folks that'll add to 40-50% overlap fiber lines, and then like a fixed wireless shot or something else as redundancy. So I think it's a question of finding the other circuits that are still acceptable within your network topology that may have less overlap.
Yeah, I'd say that we do see this a lot with like dark fiber truly being an asset, and it's leased and it's subleased. So like in many cases it may not be the same strand of fiber, but it is the identical path. And like the best thing that we've done is to validate with KMZ data. And you do see it. I mean, this came up, Matt, not that long ago where we saw two carriers that had the exact, two big carriers that had the exact route over a couple 100-mile span.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, most of these networks, people are, even if you're a big commercial carrier and it's out of market for you, you might be riding somebody else's fiber. So yeah, definitely important to check.
Well, we are pretty much out of time at this point. So I want to just take a second to thank the participants and Prashanth from Flume. If we didn't get to your question, I do apologize, but we do have them listed out, and we'll reach out to you to follow up and answer questions. Rob, any parting words before we end the webinar, sir?
No, I just want to thank Prashanth again for an informative session. So really appreciate it.
And Prashanth, I appreciate your time. Prashanth, anything before we jump off?
No, I appreciate it. Anytime. Happy to always chat about network strategies.
Right on. All right. Thanks again to all of the participants, and we'll have another webinar soon. Thanks, everyone.
Please hang up and try again.